Before we dive in, please subscribe to the channel and make sure to watch this video until the very end for some incredible insights. You won't want to miss this.
My name is Robert Hale. I am 65 years old. 3 months ago, my own children packed my bags and drove me to a retirement home. They told me it was for my own good. That the house was too big for one old man to manage alone. What they didn't tell me was that they had already spoken to a lawyer. Already signed papers. Already listed my house for sale. They thought I was just a tired old widower. Someone who wouldn't notice. Someone who wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. To understand why they were so wrong, you need to know where I came from. I grew up in a small rented house with 4 brothers and a mother who cleaned office buildings at night to keep us fed. We didn't have much. What we had, we earned the hard way. By the time I was 19, I was pouring concrete for other men's dreams, foundations for houses I could never afford to live in. I remember standing on a job site one summer, soaked in sweat, watching the site foreman drive off in a car worth more than everything my family owned combined. I told myself that day, not out of bitterness, but out of quiet determination, that one day, I would build something of my own. Something nobody could take from me. It took 11 years of saving, failing, and starting over. My first company folded after 18 months. My second one barely survived a recession that wiped out half the contractors in the state. But the third one, Hale Construction and Development, that one held. Slowly, brick by brick, contract by contract, it grew. I met Margaret during those hard years, back when I had nothing but a beat-up truck and a stack of unpaid invoices. Our first apartment together had no heating in the winter, and we used to sleep in our coats, laughing about it instead of complaining. She used to say, "Robert, we're not poor. We're just early." I never forgot that. There was one winter, our second year of marriage, when the business nearly collapsed. I came home one night and told her I didn't know if I could keep going. She didn't say a word. She just took out a jar from the cupboard, years of spare change she'd been saving without telling me, and put it on the table. "Then we start again tomorrow," she said. Together. That jar of coins covered payroll for 2 employees that month. I never forgot that either. By the time my children were born, the company had 30 employees. By the time they were teenagers, it had 300. And by the time they were adults, starting their own lives, Hale Construction had quietly folded into something much bigger, a holding company with stakes in logistics, real estate, and manufacturing across 4 states. I never told them any of this. Not because I was ashamed. Because I didn't want it to change how they saw me. I had grown up around men who worshipped their fathers' wallets and resented the men themselves. I didn't want that. I wanted my children to love Robert Hale, not Robert Hale's bank account. So I stayed quiet. I drove an old truck. I wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation for a decade. I let them believe I was simply a retired site manager, living comfortably but modestly on a pension. My son David used to say, "Dad never made anything of himself. He worked some boring old job his whole life." My daughter Claire would laugh along. "He probably has nothing saved. That's why we have to take care of him now." Take care of me. That's what they called it. My youngest, Michael, never talked that way. Michael was different, quieter, more observant. He used to sit with me in the garage on weekends while I tinkered with old tools, not saying much, just being there. I always thought, if any of my children truly knew me, it would be him. If this story is hitting close to home already, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. The day they decided to move me was disguised as a family lunch. Claire made my favorite pot roast. David brought a bottle of wine I didn't recognize the label of. For a moment, sitting at that table, I let myself believe it was simply a nice afternoon with my children. Then David cleared his throat and said the words I'd been dreading for months. "Dad, we've been talking. About the house. About you being here alone. I already knew where it was going. I let them speak. I let them lay out their concerns, my age, my isolation, the size of the house, the cost of upkeep. I let them present Sunset Meadows assisted living as though it were a gift they were giving me, rather than a decision they had already made without me. I asked only one question. Have you already looked at places? The silence that followed told me everything. 2 weeks later, moving trucks were parked in my driveway. That first night at Sunset Meadows, I sat alone on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, in a room that smelled like antiseptic in someone else's life. The walls were a pale beige. The window looked out onto a parking lot instead of the garden I'd spent 30 years cultivating. I unpacked my bag slowly. At the bottom, wrapped in an old shirt, was a photo of my late wife, Margaret, from our 30th anniversary. She'd been gone 6 years by then, but some nights, it still felt like 6 days. I held that photo for a long time. Then I whispered her name, the way I used to when I couldn't sleep. They don't know, Maggie, I said to the photo. They don't know any of it. And I don't know if I want them to find out this way. Down the hall, I could hear another resident's television playing an old game show, the laugh track echoing through thin walls. Somewhere further off, someone was crying softly. I later learned her name was Dorothy, 91 years old, no visitors in over a year. For the first time in 40 years. I felt truly alone. But loneliness, I've learned, has a strange way of clarifying things. Lying there that first night, I understood something with total certainty. My children hadn't just misjudged my finances. They had misjudged me entirely. And somewhere in that realization, quiet resolve began to take root. The day they drove me to Sunset Meadows, David handed the keys to a real estate agent standing in my driveway. He didn't even look back at me as I was helped into the car that would take me away. I watched through the rear window as my house, the house where I'd raised 3 children, buried a wife, and built a quiet, private life, grew smaller behind us. I sat in that small room they gave me, and I smiled. Because they had never once asked whose name was actually on the deed to that house. You see, 20 years ago, long before any of this, I had transferred the property, quietly, through my lawyer, with no fanfare, into a family trust. A trust one control. A trust tied to the company I built. The company now worth over $260 million. My children didn't sell my house. They sold a house that was never legally theirs to sell. What David didn't know, what none of them knew, was this: to even attempt the sale, someone had drawn up a power of attorney with my signature on it. A signature I never gave, on a document I never saw, filed by a real estate attorney David had hired without ever consulting me. I don't know to this day whether David understood what he was doing was fraud, or whether he simply trusted the wrong person to handle the paperwork. Either way, the wheels were already in motion before anyone thought to check whether the paperwork was real. The title company's final review caught it 3 days before closing, a mismatch buried in the notarization records, a signature that didn't match banking documents from 12 years prior. The sale never actually closed. The buyers, a young couple expecting their first child, walked away confused and frustrated. The real estate agent panicked, fearing liability. And David? David had no idea any of it had unraveled, because as far as he knew, the deal was already done, the money already promised, the house already gone. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. David went about his life as though the sale had gone through. He even mentioned to a coworker that he was finally getting some breathing room financially. He had no idea that 200 miles away, at a title company office, my name, my real financial identity, had just triggered a fraud investigation. Then came the call. David got a message from his supervisor that Mr. Harrington, the CEO of Harrington Logistics, the company David had spent 6 years trying to climb the ladder at, missing 2 promotions along the way, wanted to see him personally. Not his supervisor. Him. David told his wife it was probably about a project he'd pitched the month before. He wore his best shirt that day. He practiced what he'd say in the elevator mirror. He walked into that office excited. He thought it was a promotion. It wasn't. If you're enjoying this twist so far, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and I want to keep bringing you stories like this. Mr. Harrington's office was on the top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. David told me, much later, that he remembered thinking the view was beautiful right up until the moment everything changed. Mr. Harrington didn't waste time with small talk. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were the ownership documents of Harrington Logistics, corporate filings, shareholder records, the kind of paperwork David had never once thought to ask about in 6 years of employment there. "Do you recognize this name?" he asked, pointing to a line at the bottom of the shareholder registry. David squinted at the page. Then his hands started shaking. The majority shareholder. The silent investor who had quietly bought 41% of the company 3 years ago, was Robert Hale. His own father. David told me later that in that moment, the room seemed to tilt. Every assumption he'd built his entire adult identity around, that his father was simple, unremarkable, a man who'd worked some boring old job, collapsed at once. "Your father," Mr. Harrington said slowly, "never sold his house. Someone forged his signature trying to make that happen. And given that your father owns a controlling stake in this company, I think it's time you explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to put your own father in a retirement home, and attempt to sell his home out from under him." David sat frozen. He had no answer. Because the truth was, he hadn't thought of me as someone worth asking. He had simply decided, on my behalf, what my life should look like next. Mr. Harrington didn't fire him that day. Instead, he did something that would prove far more uncomfortable in the months ahead. He quietly demoted David to a junior analyst position, working under a woman David had once dismissed in a meeting as just an assistant. Every single day after that, David walked past a glass case in the lobby displaying the names of the board's major shareholders. My name was there in gold lettering. That evening, David drove home in silence, the radio off, his hands tight on the wheel. He told me later it was the longest drive of his life. He kept replaying every comment he'd made about me over the years, every eye roll at family dinners, every dismissive joke to his friends about his washed-up father. He sat in his driveway for almost 20 minutes before he could bring himself to go inside, unsure of how to explain to his own wife what had just happened, unsure of how to explain it to himself. That same week, I asked all 3 of my children to come to the house. My house. Still mine. Claire arrived first, tense and pale. What David didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Claire had lost her job at the marketing firm 2 months earlier. She'd been too proud to tell anyone, quietly applying to positions late at night after her own children were asleep, and secretly counting on her share of the house sale to cover the gap until she found something new. "Dad? I thought this was sold," she said, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the home she'd assumed she'd never see again. "It never was," I said. "Sit down." David walked in a few minutes later, pale as a ghost. He already knew what was coming. He'd had 3 days to sit with the truth since Mr. Harrington's office, 3 days of replaying every dismissive comment he'd ever made about his father's supposed lack of ambition. My youngest, Michael, arrived last, and he was the only one who looked at me with something other than shock. Michael had never wanted to send me away in the first place. He'd argued against it quietly at that lunch table, but he hadn't fought hard enough to stop it, and I could see that guilt sitting heavy on him even before I said a word. I told them everything. The company. The trust. The 40 years of building something in silence because I never wanted my children to love me for my money, I wanted them to love me for being their father. Claire cried. David sat in stunned silence, unable to meet my eyes. Michael was the only one who spoke, quietly asking, "Why didn't you just tell us, Dad?" "Because I wanted to know," I said, "whether you'd have treated me any differently if you knew. And now I have my answer." You didn't fail me, I told them. I failed myself. I let you believe I was worth nothing, and so you treated me like I was nothing. If this story means something to you, subscribe now, there's a new one just like it waiting for you, and you won't want to miss what happens next in these families. The weeks that followed were not easy for any of us. David lost more than his job status that day. He lost the version of himself he built his entire identity around, the successful son who'd made it further than his unremarkable father ever had. Every day at that glass display case in the lobby, he was reminded of exactly how wrong he'd been. Claire, still job hunting, had to face her situation without the safety net she'd quietly counted on. I didn't hand her an easy solution. Some lessons only mean something when you sit with them yourself, and I needed her to understand that money wasn't something I would simply hand out to smooth over what had happened. But I did, quietly, mention her situation to Michael, who knew of an opening at a friend's marketing agency. She got the job on her own merit, never knowing the conversation that made the opportunity cross her path in the first place. Michael I brought into the company properly, not as a favor, but because in the weeks that followed, he was the only one who showed up consistently, not to ask questions about the money, not to apologize performatively, but simply to visit, to sit with me on Sunday afternoons the way he always had, asking about my day like nothing had changed at all. That's all I ever wanted from any of them. I moved back into my house 2 months later. The locks were changed. The garden, neglected during my absence, needed weeks of work to bring back to life, work I did myself, slowly, one flower bed at a time, the same way I'd built everything else in my life. The first family dinner we all had together after everything came out was tense. Nobody quite knew where to sit, what to say, how to be around each other. Claire brought the same pot roast recipe, though this time nobody was performing for me. David arrived early, which he never used to do, and quietly helped set the table without being asked. Halfway through dinner, Michael raised his glass, a little awkwardly, and said, "To starting over." All of us. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then David raised his glass too, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. To starting over. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Claire and I still had hard conversations ahead. David and I were still rebuilding trust one phone call at a time. But for the first time in years, we were doing it honestly, without pretending, without assumptions standing in the way. Michael visits every Sunday now, just as he always did, except now there's an ease between us that wasn't there before, the ease of a truth finally spoken aloud. David calls several times a week now, awkward and quiet at first, though the conversations have started to lengthen, started to feel less like obligation and more like an attempt at something real. Money didn't change who I was. It only revealed who they were. And in the months since, I've watched all three of them slowly become something more honest than who they were before, not because of what I have, but because of what almost got lost in assuming they knew who I was without ever really asking. If you made it this far, thank you for watching till the end. Comment down below, what would you have done in my place? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there's a lot more coming. I'm Robert Hale. And this was my story.